Disclaimer: this video uses story details from Metroid Other M in part of its overview of the manga storyline when compared to the game's storyline. I am aware of Other M's controversial nature in the Metroid community in regards to its storyline and alleged contradictions with the wider lore. Addressing these contradictions and the storyline as a whole is a task not suited for this video, as it falls far outside of the scope of this video's aims. I ask the inclusion of Other M be taken in stride. If this cannot be done, then the points about Other M can be ignored, because the meat of this video concerns the core 2D Metroid games. Hello there. In this video, I will lay out why the manga, simply titled Metroid, is not canon. This manga was published chapter for chapter from January 2003 to May 2004 in the Japanese magazine Z, according to Japanese sources, and 2 volumes compiling chapters of the manga were released independently from each other as well during this run. An e-manga adapting the first few chapters of the manga in color and with sound was released as well, although it is no longer available as of writing. The manga's story features the supposed backstory of Metroid series protagonist Samus Aran and is divided roughly into 3 parts, each separated by a time skip. Chapter 1 to the middle of Chapter 2, showing the space pirate attack on colony K2L and how Samus was first brought to Zebes by the Chozo. Chapter 2 to Chapter 12, showing Samus's teenage years, her times in the Federation Police, and her first mission to Zebes. And Chapter 13 to Chapter 16, showing the lead up to and an adaptation of the events of the original Metroid game. However, there are many problems that exist between the story of the manga and the details we get of the backstory in the current canon of the games. Simply providing a list of inconsistencies is not something I want to do here, however, but also considering several other factors, how discrepancies might have evolved over time. The basis of the manga's canonicity. A fair question to ask before starting to pick apart why the manga isn't canon is to ask why it would be considered canon in the first place. In my research, I have not been able to find one sole reason. For example, there are no sources where the people involved in creating the games have commented on the matter. The Metroid fandom wiki does mention that Yoshio Sakamoto, the man in charge of the Metroid series as a whole ever since the early 2000s, was an editorial supervisor and general editor for the manga. 2 sources are provided for this paragraph. First, linking to an interview conducted by computerandvideogames.com with Sakamoto in 2003, which goes over his role as the new head of Nintendo R&D 1 and his role in the development of the Metroid series, both the core 2D titles and the Metroid Prime games. The manga is not mentioned in this source. Other source, personnel overview page from a website known as insider.com about Sakamoto, is no longer available, and all archives lead back to the corrupted page. The only time Sakamoto, to my knowledge, ever commented on the manga directly was in an interview that can be found on the old Metroid website, the Depths of Nintendo of Japan's website. In this interview, he stated when asked how he thought the Metroid series would continue. "If I can, I want the series to keep going. From here on, I think I want to develop Samus as a character. I might also create a story going back to the past of Adam and Samus. However, Kodansha's magazine Z is also serializing a manga. I think that's a different way to enjoy Metroid." Aside from the seeds of what would later become the story of Metroid Other M, Sakamoto only calls the manga a different way to enjoy Metroid and doesn't comment on its canonicity. He also doesn't indicate if he has played a role in the manga's creation. At least by the way the Metroid database translated the interview, the phrasing implies he didn't have a hand in it. Kodansha's magazine Z is also serializing a manga, meaning that this is something that happened independently of him. He also isn't credited on things like Japanese store pages. For example, on one page, Nintendo is listed as an author alongside Koji Tazawa, the writer, and Kenji Ishikawa, the illustrator, are both not directly part of Nintendo as far as I am aware. In an interview with the website Shine Sparkers, Nate Bildorf, the localization manager for Nintendo of America, does mention the official manga relating to Samus' childhood and insinuates it is canon. However, his grasp on the lore of the Metroid series isn't always the best, as is evidenced by the North American version of Metroid Prime, of which he is credited as the sole writer, and of which he claims to have written a substantial amount. This version of the game is notably inconsistent with the wider lore of the series, as demonstrated by its manual. The manual states, for example, that the space pirates stole Metroid specimen that was discovered by the Galactic Federation before the pirates conquered the planet Zebes. The manual also says the pirates lurked on Zebes, even as Samus was growing up there. This contradicts the manuals of many of the 2D games, which say that the pirates captured the Metroid just before the events of Metroid Zero mission, when Samus was already a grown woman. Insinuation in the Prime manual is also that Zebes was already a space pirate base by the time the attack on the colony K2L took place. Aside from these instances, I cannot find that anyone who worked on the Metroid game series in Japan, or otherwise, was involved with the manga or mentioned it. Though if there are such instances, I would be happy to know. The angle of direct developer involvement just doesn't seem to work, though there are a few arguments to be made in favor of the manga's canonicity. A select few elements originating in the manga did later go on to appear or be referenced in the games. The modern design of Samus' Chozo caretaker, called Old Bird in the manga, first appeared in the manga. Old Bird first appears in the first chapter of the manga, which released in January 2003. A design very much like it also appeared in endings exclusive to the Japanese version of Metroid Fusion, which released in February 2003, a month after the first manga chapter. The design would go on to reappear in Metroid Zero mission, and has thus far not been seen again in the games. There are two caveats here, however. The first is that the manga did not invent the character of Old Bird, since the Chozo by that name, who raised Samus, appeared first in the Super Metroid comic that appeared in Nintendo Power from February 1994 to June 1994. The design of that Old Bird was different from the manga design, but does share similarities with the design in Fusion, in its color scheme and the fact that Old Bird appears shirtless in one of the endings. The second caveat is that the first manga chapter and the Japanese version of Metroid Fusion released rather close to each other, within a month. Due to this, it is also possible that the manga lifted the design from internal preliminary art for Metroid Fusion's Japanese exclusive endings, or just the endings themselves if they were already finished at that time. Of note here is that the design of Samus as a young child follows more or less the same history, originating in the 90s and appearing in the manga and various games. The name of the military flagship piloted by Adam Malkovich is the Vixif in the manga. This name was also used for a similar ship in the backstory of Metroid Other M. Full naming of the ships: Federation Army Special Ops Battleship Vixif 4 in the manga and flagship of the Galactic Federation Army Vixif in Other M, also differ slightly, and their designs are different as well. The name in general is a reference to X, a video game for the Game Boy that featured a ship of the same name and was also developed in part by Yoshio Sakamoto. The design of the Galactic Federation Council used in the introduction of Samus Returns, which features a set of circular turbines floating above a planet with a circular platform in the middle, seems to be based on the manga due to its borderline identical design. The other main argument in favor of the manga's canonicity is a passage from the old Japanese Metroid site. The site has a page dedicated to the manga, which states the following: "For playing the most recent games, players may want to immerse themselves in the world of Metroid, which cannot be clearly understood from just playing the games." This seems pretty clear cut. The caveat is that the same website has a chronicle of the Metroid timeline, containing all the Metroid games that had been released at the time: Metroid, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, Super Metroid, Metroid Fusion, and Metroid Prime. As can be observed, the manga is not listed on this timeline, which is odd if the makers of the site wanted to push the idea that the manga is indeed part of official Metroid chronology. Furthermore, aside from this timeline, various other Metroid timelines have been released over the years, none of which listed the manga as part of the chronology. While they differed in which games they included, some exclude the Metroid Prime sub-series and Metroid Other M, the manga's absence is one constant here. 1. A timeline from the Japanese Zero Mission manual, which includes Metroid, Metroid Prime, Metroid 2, Super Metroid, and Metroid Fusion. Zero Mission also replacing Metroid. 2. Timeline from the Japanese Zero Mission website, including Metroid, Zero Mission, Prime, Metroid 2, Super, and Fusion. 3. Timeline from the Metroid Prime 2 bonus disc, including Metroid, Zero Mission, Prime, Prime 2, Metroid 2, Super, and Fusion. Note that the flavor text on the disc clarifies Zero Mission is an expansion of the events of the first Metroid game, not something that happens fully after the NES game. 4. Timeline from the Nintendo Power June 2010 issue, featuring Metroid, Zero Mission, Prime, Prime Hunters, Prime 2, Prime 3, Metroid 2, Super, Other M, and Fusion. Note that Zero Mission is once again called a retelling of the first NES game that expanded on the ending. 5. Timeline from a Japanese Other M guide featuring Metroid, Zero Mission, Prime, Prime Hunters, Prime 2, Prime 3, Metroid 2, Super, Other M, and Fusion. 6. Timeline from the Japanese Samus Returns website featuring Metroid, Metroid 2, Super, Other M, and Fusion, with Samus Returns also replacing Metroid 2 and the Metroid Prime games being absent. 7. Timeline from the SNES Classic booklet, featuring Zero Mission, Prime, Prime Hunters, Prime 2, Prime 3, Prime Federation Force, Samus Returns, Super, Other M, and Fusion. 8. Timeline released as part of the marketing of Metroid Dread, featuring Metroid, Metroid 2, Super, Fusion, and Dread. Prime games and Other M are absent in line with other Dread marketing, focusing on the number 2D titles, of which Dread was the first fully new installment in 19 years. This is as far as the arguments for the manga's canonicity go. Some designs have made it into the games, all of which come with strings attached, and a quote from an old official website. Developers and official timelines have never included the manga as part of the official chronology. Aside from this, however, there are also a great number of non-arguments often made in favor of the manga's canonicity. These consist of story elements that are thought to originate in the manga and later made it into the games. However, these elements actually originated in older materials and are not invented by the manga. The Metroids being created by the Chozo to exterminate the X-Parasites. Metroids being artificial in nature was first invented by Super Metroid in the 90s, and then being made to exterminate the X-Parasite was first brought up in the English version of Metroid Fusion, which came out in November 2002, 2 months before the first manga chapter released. Samus being the survivor of a space pirate attack on a colony named K2L, being taken in by the Chozo afterwards, who infused her with their blood. These details first came up in a 1994 Japanese Super Metroid guide, albeit in a strange fortune teller section. This guide also features interviews from the developers of Super Metroid. These details were also mentioned in the Nintendo Power Super Metroid comic discussed earlier, which released also in 1994. These details were mentioned twice more after this, but before the manga came out. In Samus's trophies in Super Smash Bros. Melee, December 2001, though the Japanese version does not reference K12's name nor the blood infusion, it also attests that Samus was an orphan raised by the Chozo. And the North American Manual of Metroid Prime, November 2002. This manual was noted earlier to be inconsistent with the games, while this is still an instance of bringing up these details, which were later confirmed to be canon before the manga did. Since these details came up several times, it is likely the details of Samus' backstory were first worked out during Super Metroid's development in developer notes or something similar, which these various sources refer to. Samus living on Zebes among the Chozo during her childhood. Samus living on Zebes during her childhood was first mentioned in the North American Manual of Metroid Prime. Samus serving in the armed forces of the Galactic Federation under Commander Adam Malkovich. This is first referenced in the English version of Metroid Fusion, which came out 2 months before the first manga chapter. Creatures that first appeared in the manga being put in Zero Mission as bosses, specifically the Kirugiru Imago and Diohimu. These bosses appear in the 15th manga chapter, Tooth and Nail, which released in April 2004. The manga's release schedule is kept in mind. Metroid Zero Mission first released in North America in February of 2004 and in Australia in March of that year, both of which predate the release of Tooth and Nail. Discrepancies between the manga and the games that came out before it. That covers about all the arguments that support the manga's canonicity and those that are often wrongly made in support as well. So it is time to move on to the discrepancies. This section covers errors the manga made in regards to games that came out before it: Metroid, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, Super Metroid, English version of Metroid Fusion, and original North American version of Metroid Prime. One could consider the manga to have retconned these details. Some of these details were carried forward in later games, as will be shown later in the video. In Metroid's manual, it is specified that after the space pirates stole a Metroid specimen from a Galactic Federation research vessel, they took it back to their base on Zebes. The Federation Police, an organization formed to fight the pirates in the Metroid NES game, only found the planet after a desperate search. It was not known that the pirates lived on Zebes. This is reiterated in Metroid Prime, which has a scan of the planet Zebes that states that the planet was considered unremarkable before it became a space pirate base. In the manga, these events are the second time the Federation orders a mission to Zebes. The first took place several years before, when Samus was still a teenager, and it happened at the same time that the pirates first took over Zebes. So when the space pirates steal the Metroids from the Federation in the manga, and Samus informs Chairman Keaton of the Federation Council of Mother Brain's role in the Metroid's development, it is immediately concluded that Zebes is the pirate base. There was no search from the Federation police here. This contradicts Metroid and Prime. The latter because in the manga, Zebes was already known as the world where Samus was raised by the Chozo at the time of the invasion. In the manual of Metroid, it is also specified that the Federation police attacked Zebes after it was discovered to be a pirate base. After this fails, the Federation sends in Samus to kick off the events of the game. No such attack takes place in the events leading up to the manga's adaptation of the events of the first game. Though there is an implied attack during the second time skip, this is several years before the relevant time frame. Samus even remarks that it is better to send her in as a lone bounty hunter so the mission can stay off the books and beneath the Federation's notice to avoid their involvement. In the manuals of Metroid, Metroid 2, Super Metroid, and English Fusion, it is specified that a research vessel mounted the expedition to SR-388, where the Federation discovered the existence of the Metroids. It was these researchers who took a Metroid aboard their vessel that was then raided by the space pirates. This is contradicted by the manga, where there are instead two teams. A survey team that discovered SR-388, which also discovered and was subsequently killed by the Metroids. A second team was then sent to capture the Metroids after the Federation realized how dangerous they were, but this team was raided by the space pirates. No mention is ever made of two teams being involved in the events of the games. This instead seems to follow the events leading up to Metroid 2, where, after the events of the first game, the Federation sends another survey team to SR-388 to assess the threat of the Metroids. After this team perishes, a team of armed Federation police officers was sent to assess the threat, but this team perished as well. In the Japanese intro of Super Metroid, Samus explains that the events of the original Metroid is when she first learned of the Metroid's existence. She and the Federation later discover the artificial nature of the Metroids, after Samus brings the last baby Metroid from SR-388 to Ceres Space Colony for study. Researchers there discover it is highly likely the Metroids were artificially made for peaceful purposes. This is all explained in the Japanese manual of Super Metroid. Both of these story points are contradicted by the manga. During Samus's first mission to Zebes, which was discussed in the first point above and supposedly takes place years before Metroid for the NES, a recording is discovered from Old Bird. In this recording, he explains to Samus that the Metroids were made by the hand of the Chozo to maintain peace in the galaxy, but the X-parasites aren't mentioned. This contradicts the intro of Super Metroid. Years later, in the lead up to her second mission to Zebes, the adaptation of NES Metroid, she relays this information to Hardy, a commander of the Federation Police, and Keaton. This poses somewhat of a problem for the events after the manga, since it seems doubtful the Federation would order the extermination of all Metroids if they knew they were made by the Chozo for the sake of galactic peace. Discrepancies between the manga and the games that came out during it. This section covers errors the manga made in regards to games that came out during it. The Japanese version of Metroid Fusion, which came out after chapter 1 of the manga and around chapter 2. Japanese version of Metroid Prime, which came out around chapter 3 of the manga, and Metroid Zero Mission, which came out around chapter 13 of the manga in the United States and around the final chapter in Japan. Some of these points will be reiterations of points in the previous section to show the manga did not retcon these points in regards to the games. In the Japanese manual of Metroid Fusion, the point about the Metroid's artificial nature being discovered on Ceres Space Colony in the intro of Super Metroid is reaffirmed. The manga would go on to ignore this in one of its later chapters, which came out a year after the Japanese version of Metroid Fusion. The Japanese version of Metroid Fusion establishes that Adam Malkovich was a commander in the Federation army, that Samus served under him to complete missions. Adam being a commander in the army is still true in the manga, but Samus at no point serves directly under him in the army. Instead, she serves in the Galactic Federation Police, which is considered a separate organization in the games. This is most evident in the Japanese manual Zero Mission, which mentions both organizations separately and the role they each played in finding Zebes before the events of the game, retconning the story of Metroid for the NES, which states that only the police was involved in this search. According to the Japanese manual of Metroid Zero Mission, the police was responsible for finding the planet itself, after which the army launched an attack. This also nicely demonstrates their separate roles. The police is more a reconnaissance organization, while the army is a proper standing military that performs large-scale battles. In the current canon, the police is further referenced in Samus Returns, where a special police team was sent to investigate the presence of Metroid on SR388, and Super Metroid, where they provide Samus with intel about Zebes in the manual. The army is a far more prominent organization, appearing in Metroid Prime 2, Prime 3, Federation Force, ORM, and Fusion. The divide between the army and the police is also present in the manga itself. Samus is tasked with investigating pirate activity on a remote planet in Chapter 3 First Battle, and is apprehended by a superior, Chief Hardy, after attacking the pirates due to disobeying orders, with the army having laid in wait to attack. In the next chapter, Threat, the separation of jurisdiction between the army and the police is also made explicit by Samus's police colleague Grates, who objects to Chief Hardy to going with Adam because Adam is of the army. Doing so would mix jurisdictions. One could say that Samus would go on to join the army under Adam during the second time skip in the manga between chapter 12 and 13. But in chapter 13, Samus states that after her first mission to Zebes under the Federation, which ended in chapter 12, she decided to become a warrior by becoming an independent bounty hunter and leaving the life of a Federation officer behind. The insignia of the Federation police from the manga is also shown as Samus states this, making explicit that she is referring to the police and not the army. In the Japan exclusive endings of Fusion, the only in-game visual of the space pirates' attack on the K2L colony is shown. The image does not follow the specifics of the manga's depiction of the K2L attack. In the image, a man is shown engaging Ridley and a group of Zebesian space pirates, likely Samus's father, who wields a similar gun in the manga as in the image. However, in the manga, Samus's father never fights against Ridley, and Ridley never goes into any buildings in the first chapter of the manga either. Instead, he confronts a small Samus in the open air, with her mother running towards her and Ridley killing her. In Fusion, a woman, who can be presumed to be Samus's mother, clutches Samus tight as the man fights off the space pirates and Ridley. In the manga, Samus's father is at a whole separate location while Ridley confronts Samus. In addition to the previous point, the Japan exclusive endings of Fusion also show how Old Bird found Samus on K2L, and once more the specifics of the manga are not followed. In Fusion, Old Bird alone finds her in a container or hallway of some sort, while in the manga, Old Bird and his companion Grey Voice encounter Samus by chance in the open air. Fusion's depiction of this event is more in line with that of the Nintendo Power Super Metroid comic than that of the manga. Zero Mission contradicts the manga by specifying that its events are Samus' first battle on the planet Zebes. The manga adapts these events in its last couple of chapters, but the manga depicts this as Samus' second mission to the planet. The first mission to Zebes was several years before, according to the manga, around the same time the space pirates took over Zebes. It is also impossible for this first mission to represent the events of the first Metroid game or Zero Mission, due to the general flow of events being entirely different. While the brain survives this mission, Ridley is never defeated by Samus, and there are no Metroids on Zebes. In the manga's second mission, Ridley is defeated by Samus, and there are Metroids on Zebes. During the portion of the manga that adapts the events of the first Metroid game or Zero Mission, Samus fights the various bosses in scenarios that are impossible in Zero Mission. Specifically, in the manga, she fights the Diorumu and Kirugiru imago at the same time, with the former playing a part in attacking the latter. Immediately after their defeat, Mother Brain summons Kraid for Samus to fight. In Zero Mission, these bosses are all fought separately, separated by notable amounts of time and each in a different area of Zebes. During the adaptation portion of the manga, chapter 16 specifically, Samus meets an apparition of Grey Voice, who leads her to a Chozo statue with the Varia suit. In Zero Mission, Samus never encounters any Chozo at all and finds the Varia suit on her own. When compared to Zero Mission, the adaptation portion of the manga cuts off short. The post-game that was introduced in Zero Mission, wherein Samus infiltrates the Chozodia ruins and the space pirate mothership and blows the latter up, is not covered since the manga ends at confrontation with Mother Brain in Turian. This is especially odd given the fact that the space pirate mothership is featured throughout the last chapters of the manga. The title Zero Mission is referenced near the end of chapter 14 of the manga. Framing Samus' confrontation with Mother Brain as the end of the story is not correct in regards to Zero Mission, with this more being in line with the original Metroid. Zebes being considered unremarkable before it was discovered to be a base for space pirates is not only reinforced in the Japanese version of Metroid Prime, but the Japanese version goes as far as to imply Planet Zebes was completely unknown to the Federation prior to their desperate search. As mentioned in a previous point, the story leading up to the events of the first Metroid game was also retconned in Zero Mission's Japanese manual. The details that contradict the manga remain intact, however. The police still had to search for the space pirate base, indicating the Federation had no prior knowledge of Zebes being such a base. The Federation attacking Zebes prior to the events in Zero Mission remains part of the storyline in that game, though the attack is now performed by the Army, an organization introduced in Metroid Fusion, instead of the police. This is another detail contradicting the manga that remained intact despite the retcons in the Japanese manual. There only being one expedition to SR-388 by the Federation prior to the events of Zero Mission is reiterated in the Japanese manual of Metroid Prime. This is another detail contradicting the manga that remained intact despite the retcons in the Japanese manual Zero Mission. During a Q&A session with Yoshio Sakamoto on the Japanese website for Zero Mission, he commented that the Chozo only settled on Zebes after the Metroids became feral. The civilization on SR-388 was destroyed. The civilization on SR-388 was first alluded to in the manual of the original Metroid. Metroid 2 was then the first game to allude to the Chozo specifically, again also mentioning the civilization of SR-388 several times in its manual. The Japanese manual calls the statues left behind by the civilization something that can be translated to statue of Birdman. The English manual mistranslated this as artifact or statue, and so obscures the first mention of the Chozo in the Metroid series. The term from the manual was in later games shortened by English localizers as Chozo. With Sakamoto's quote in mind, it becomes clear that in the game canon, the intended order of events is that the Chozo residing on SR-388 created the Metroids, after which the Metroids went rogue, the Chozo of SR-388 perished, and only after all these events did the Chozo come to colonize planet Zebes. This is in stark contrast to the manga, which instead shows Chozo of Zebes and Mother Brain creating and monitoring the Metroids remotely from Zebes and other locations. Later, they bring a specimen to Zebes to show it to the other Chozo. It is possible that there is meant to be a civilization of Chozo on SR-388 off-page during the events of the manga, but it is never mentioned. Old Bird does mention in the first chapter that the X-parasites, being native to SR-388, have been increasing alone for some time. This would go against the idea that the Chozo civilization exists on SR-388 at this time, while the Metroids are already in development, according to the first chapter as well. It is possible that Chozo established the civilization on SR-388 sometime after the first chapter, but this goes against the answer of Yoshio Sakamoto from the Q&A. Of note is that the question being answered mentioned the manga, and Sakamoto directly contradicted the manga. All of this is wholly incompatible with the manga, as the order of events are far too skewed by Chozo existing on Zebes before the Metroids went rogue. tying into a previous point and the Japanese version of Metroid Prime, the timing of the Metroid's creation also differs between the games and the manga. In the manga, the Metroids are created and deployed on SR388 between 11 and 20 years before the events of the series, based on the given years for the manga's 2 time skips. In Metroid Prime, the titular being gives a different timing. Metroid Prime is a Metroid heavily mutated by Phasal, which can be found inside the Leviathan on the planet Talon 4. The Leviathan, a living Phasal-producing meteor, hit Talon 4 about 50 years before the start of the series, as explained in Metroid Prime 3. Metroid must have entered the Leviathan at that time, because the Chozo living on Talon 4 soon erected a force field around the Leviathan. There is a common idea that Metroid Prime is a Metroid that originated from the batch that the space pirates who invaded Talon 4 brought with them, shortly before the events of Metroid Prime the game. In Prime 3, it is namely shown that Metroids exposed to Phasal can become Phasal Metroids, which have the ability to phase through walls. However, Prime 3 also shows that Phasal Metroids cannot phase through energy shields, evidenced by the fact that the space pirates imprison the creatures with the use of energy shields, both on their base in Skytown and on the pirate homeworld. The Japanese version of Prime 3 also implies that Phasal Metroids are created by the pure Phasal of Dark Samus, who only came into being after the events of the first Metroid Prime game. A Metroid thus must have been around 50 years ago on Talon 4, to enter the Leviathan before the Chozo erected their force field. Metroid Prime also wields weapons it seemingly absorbed from the Chozo: Power Beam, Wave Beam, Ice Beam, Plasma Beam, Missiles, and Grapple Beam. The original North American release of Metroid Prime, it was said that the creature obtained these weapons from a space pirate, who obtained them by reverse engineering Samus's weapons, but this was retconned in the Japanese versions, with mentions of this being removed, and the pirates not having access to reverse engineered Samus weapons during Metroid Prime. The various beam trooper variations in the Japanese version instead were suits that infused them directly with Phasal, which leads to various mutations weak to Samus's various beams. Metroid Prime also wields 2 weapons, Missiles and Grapple Beam. The pirates are never shown or mentioned to have replicated. Discrepancies between the manga and games that came out after it. This section covers errors the manga made in regards to the games that came out after it: Prime 2, Prime Hunters, Prime 3, Other M, Prime Federation Force, Samus Returns, and Red. Some of these points will be reiterations of points in the previous sections, to further show the manga did not retcon these points in regards to the games. There only being one expedition to SR388 by the Federation prior to the events of Zero Mission is reiterated in the introduction of Samus Returns. This means that this detail has stayed consistent since the first Metroid game on the NES, throughout Zero Mission's retcon of the manual, all the way up to Samus Returns. The manga's version of the events leading up to Zero Mission or Metroid is consistently ignored by the games on multiple occasions. Other M expanded the backstory of Samus introduced in Fusion, specifically the time that she served under Adam in the Federation army. Other M is made very explicit Samus served in the army under Adam, which reiterates the point made in the previous section about the different branches of the Federation. Furthermore, Other M also explores the incident that led Samus to leave the army and become a bounty hunter. It was due to Adam giving an order that led to the death of his brother and Samus' friend Ian, which Samus did not handle well, and so she left. In the manga, Samus decided to become a warrior as a bounty hunter after her first mission to Zebes to carry on the legacy of the Chozo. In tandem with the previous point, the character of Anthony Hayes, who is a member of the Galactic Federation army and one of Samus' former fellow platoon members, is not featured in the manga. Instead of using one of the fellow police members introduced in the manga, Kratos or Mauk, Other M instead opted to invent the new character of Anthony, also showing that the members of Samus' squad in the army were all humans instead of aliens. Many times in the manga, the Zebesian space pirates are shown to be capable of speech and independent thinking. Other M establishes, meanwhile, that the Zebesians, without a malicious intent to guide them to malicious actions, are merely ferocious animals, meaning they do not have intelligence of their own. The manga does specify that the Zebesians naturally have the tendency to follow the orders of the strongest master due to their genetics, but they are still more civilized than Other M describes them as, being capable of speech. It should be noted here that this point is specifically about the Zebesian space pirates, who feature in Super Metroid, Fusion, Zero Mission, and Other M, with allusions to them being present in Prime, Samus Returns, and Red. They are not the only race making the larger organization of space pirates, however, with the other two mainstays being the intelligent Australian space pirates featured in the Prime series, who have their own homeworld, or Dragus, that is shown in Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, and capable of science, and the Kai Hunters from Super Metroid, Fusion and Other M. Space pirates in the manga are all clearly Sabesian though, with their insect-like exoskeletons and large claws at the end of their arms. The formal dress of high-ranking military officials in the Federation is different between the manga and the games. This formal wear is featured in Other M's flashbacks, where Adam wears them, in Metroid Prime Federation Force, where Commander Alex Miles wears a power suit version of this garb, and in Dread, which shows Adam as depicted in Other M's flashbacks in two unlockable images. During ground missions, Adam also wears a power suit of some kind instead of this formal wear. In the manga, he instead wears a different formal attire and does this during a ground mission. The logo of the Galactic Federation that was introduced in Other M is different from the one used in the manga. It could be argued that the logo was changed between the time of the manga and the time that Other M takes place, but the logo is also shown in flashbacks in Other M that depict the same general time period as the manga. The logo introduced in Other M went on to be prominently featured in Metroid Prime Federation Force, and was also used less prominently in Samus Returns and Dread. Samus Returns is the first game in the series to show the story of the Chozo of SR388 in detail. This is done via the Chozo memories, which show that the Chozo first settled on SR388, only then discovering the X-Parasites and made the Metroids in retaliation. Old Bird says in chapter 1 of the manga that the X are proliferating alone, which necessitates that the Chozo only settle SR388 later, or that the Chozo memories take place before the time frame of the manga's first chapter. Samus Returns debunks the first scenario by showing the Chozo were already on SR388 before becoming aware of the X-Parasites, in contrast to the manga, which showed they were aware before having Chozo on the planet. The second scenario is debunked by the fact that the Chozo memories show the SR388 Chozo creating the Metroids and successfully eliminating almost all X, yet the Metroids are still in active development as of the manga's second chapter. Metroid Dread further expanded on the events of SR388 by explaining that the Chozo civilization of the planet was known as the Toha tribe, and that they were slaughtered by a tribe of Chozo called the Malkin, which also appeared in the Chozo memories from Samus Returns. The Malkin also had influence on Zebes, and murals in the area Varenia on their homeworld of CDR show this to an extent. In these murals, powersuit-clad Chozo are shown fighting against Sabesian space pirates, while Mother Brain looms behind them. This depicts Mother Brain allying with the space pirates and driving the Chozo off of Zebes through sheer numbers, with the Malkin managing to escape to later create this mural on ZDR. This also doesn't depict a more ancient event, given the presence of Mother Brain. It was only created after the settling of Zebes and the SR388 massacre, going by Sakamoto's words as explained in the previous section. While the murals on ZR are archaic in style, they nonetheless depict relatively recent events. This all is in contrast to how Mother Brain's purge of the Sabesian Chozo is depicted in the manga. There they are all frail old men who are easily pushed around by the space pirate. The Chozo Grey Voice does don a power suit to fight against the pirates after feigning loyalty to them. He dies to Ridley. Zebes is thus not shown to have a group of Chozo warriors fighting against the pirates, and the Sabesian Chozo only managed to escape thanks to the help of Samus and the Federation army, while Dread suggests otherwise on both fronts with the mural. In Metroid Dread, it is stated and shown that Samus received DNA from two Chozo, Ravenbeak, the leader of the Malkin, and an unspecified member of the Toha tribe. Ravenbeak and at least 5 other Chozo oversaw this procedure. This is in contrast to the manga, where Samus only received DNA from Grey Voice, with only him and Old Bird overseeing the procedure. It could be argued that the unspecified Toha donor is Grey Voice, but this runs into issues. Since Sakamoto stated that Zebes was only settled by the Chozo after the Toha were massacred, this is impossible because the only Toha who was left alive was the Chozo known as Quiet Robe, as explained by himself. Based on this, it should be inferred that Quiet Robe is the donor of Zebes' Chozo Toha DNA. Even if Sakamoto's statement is disregarded, however, issues remain. If Grey Voice was a Toha and allied or at least on neutral terms with Ravenbeak, does not make sense that the Malkin would let Quiet Rope live. He was only kept alive because Toha DNA is necessary to control Metroids. So if Ravenbeak already had a Toha ally in the form of Grey Voice, or knew of him, this would be unnecessary, and Quiet Rope would have been killed, regardless of if the SR388 massacre happened before or after Samus being infused with DNA. It can also not be said that Quiet Rope is Grey Voice, because Grey Voice dies years before the events of the series proper, and Quiet Rope is still alive when Dread, the last game in the chronology as of writing, starts. Grey Voice is also not a clone of Quiet Rope, as this would negate the need for Samus from Ravenbeak's perspective. He would then have a Toha loyal to him that could control Metroids for him and be infused with Malkin DNA. A last avenue that can be thought of here is that Samus was infused with Chozo DNA twice, once with Grey Voices and then with Ravenbeaks and Quiet Ropes at another time. However, this seems unintuitive from the perspective of the Zebesian Chozo. In the manga, it is stated that Samus was given their DNA so she could live in an inhospitable environment of Zebes. The Chozo in the manga also want Samus to become their successor in being protectors of the galaxy, and a strong warrior who fights for eternal peace. In this case, why did they not immediately infuse Samus with the DNA of Ravenbeak, who is a far more capable warrior than the old Grey Voice? If they also gave Samus the DNA so she could become a better warrior? It is after all known from Dread that the Metroid's creators, said in the manga to be Old Bird and Mother Brain, were aware of the Malkin tribe, as the Metroids were genetically coded to be hostile to the Malkin. It can however be speculated that Ravenbeak forced them to go along with his plans to make Samus a bioweapon, after she had already been infused with Grey Voice's DNA. However, the scientists who performed the procedure on Samus, as shown in Red, do not seem particularly bothered by the whole operation either. A last note that should be made here is that Mother Brain in the manga does bring up that Samus was given Chozo DNA and a power suit with the intent of becoming a living weapon. However, the Chozo in the manga never echo this sentiment and instead see Samus as their child who they love. The manga frames this as a lie from Mother Brain, who is depicted as insane and at odds with the Chozo after she goes berserk. Thus the reveal from Metroid Dread that the Chozo Zebes worked with Ravenbeak to make Samus a bioweapon, for whatever reasons, even sympathetic reasons to a degree, is heavily at odds with this framing. Conclusion. As has hopefully been amply demonstrated, there exist quite a few discrepancies between the manga and the various games, most consistently the core 2D series. It is true that the games from time to time make small references to the manga, but these are mostly limited to shallow visual or name references, not big parts of the storyline. Exception to this is of course the existence of Old Bird, but his character is originally from the 1994 Super Metroid comic. In fact, the manga borrows quite a few different characters from this comic: Chief Hardy of the Galactic Federation Police and Chairman Keaton of the Galactic Federation Council. Their roles in the comic differ from that in the manga, although their designs are fairly similar. This is to illustrate that the manga itself also borrows whole characters from previous works that are incompatible with its story-wise. For example, the comic stating that space pirates attacked K2L around the same time Zebes was taken over by them, while in the manga, the conquest of Zebes happens only a decade after the attack on K2L. Games have also taken cues from that comic as well, yet it is never argued that it is canon, despite it having one of the first mentions of K2L in any piece of media. There has also been no word from the Japanese developers that the manga is canon, and the one instance of it being brought up as canon was from an American localization manager who has a demonstrably poor understanding of the storyline. The manga has also never been listed on any official Metroid timeline put out by Nintendo, either in Japan or in the West. Aside from this, it is most notable that the inconsistencies within the manga are not isolated to a single era of the history of the Metroid series. The manga contradicts each game that came out before it in some way, which could be written off as retcons. However, the games that came out during and after the manga's run kept mentioning some of the details that were problematic. This makes the retcon idea more problematic, for if a piece of supplementary work introduces a retcon, and then a later main piece of work retcons back to how it was before the supplementary work came along, there is a pretty good chance there was no retcon at all, and the supplementary work is just not canon. Furthermore, the games that came out during and after the manga's run also introduced new details that were inconsistent with the manga. Overall, the games thus ignore the manga storyline, and rather build their own storyline that has at times taken some visual cues from the manga. As time goes on and more games come out, inconsistencies will continue to pile up, and it would be, for the best, to not try to put the manga into the game continuity because of this. Square pegs don't fit into round holes.